Wichita Pachyderm, please give a warm welcome and a round of applause for today's speaker, John Axtell.
Thank you, Aaron. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the very kind introduction and the warm welcome. I was a lot younger back in those days, so candidates, please don't get any wise ideas, okay, about the potential, okay? But no, I really love, I can't say this while being representing Campaign for Liberty because we are a 501c4, so I can't talk about candidates and things like that. I wish I could. But so I'm going to talk about just policy today. And I'd like to talk about the Kansas Legal Tender Act, which was a bill introduced, and I'll talk about the bill in particular. But the theme of this presentation is why the Constitution matters and how gold and silver money will truly solve many, if not most, of the problems that we have in our federal level and the state level as well today. So Blake Branson, as Aaron mentioned, Blake Branson and I have been running Campaign for Liberty Kansas here for the last 12 years roughly. And our signature issue at Campaign for Liberty is audit the Fed. And so that means gold and silver money is an extremely important issue for us. Our slogan is to restore the Constitution. And that's the way we solve problems, is to enforce or restore the Constitution. So in this presentation, I'd like to first discuss why fiat currency, our current money, is such a horrible idea. And then I'd like to talk about and how the fiat currency causes the problems we have. Then I'd like to talk about the Kansas Legal Tender Act and why gold and silver is so important, and then what the Kansas Legal Tender Act specifically does and what it doesn't do, and then the next steps we would do after passing the Kansas Legal Tender Act. So we see the problems. There's a huge number of problems. We have debt and inflation out of control and at levels we've never seen before except maybe 40 years ago. We have corruption at every level of government and decaying moral values, both in our government and in our civic population. And finally, what I see coming is if we don't stop it, we will have a central bank digital currency, or a CBDC. And with that will come the ESG, or environmental, social, and governance metrics. And if the federal government ever decides to impose those metrics, those woke metrics on us through the CBDC, they could control every one of our behaviors by simply shutting off our supply of our money, our access to our money, when we decide we want to buy a homeschool curriculum or contribute to particular candidates or maybe buy a firearm or some ammunition. The CBDC will enable that kind of control over our money. Now, what's common about every one of the problems that I just mentioned? Well, it's the simple fact that the founders told us so. They warned us that the kind of money we have today, an unbacked paper currency, would cause these problems and more. George Washington wrote to Thomas Jefferson that paper money will ruin commerce, oppress the honest, and open the door to every species of fraud and injustice. So, ruin commerce. Gosh, we've seen that. Paper money caused the boom and bust cycle in housing roughly 15, 20 years ago. What did that do to contractors and developers? It drove them out of the market, and in fact, it did so clearly and so profoundly that contractors and developers left entire developments to languish. Remember that 15 or 20 years ago, those news reports, and you'd see a whole development just wasting away, windows broken, never getting sold. We had too many contractors and builders, and the Fed drove them out of the market. That created a shortage of contractors and builders, and over the last 10 to 15 years, not enough homes were built. Well, by golly, guess who did that? The Federal Reserve destroyed markets, as the founders said they would. It will oppress the honest, Washington said. Well, think about the poor people who try to gain a foothold in our economy, and they have to save in the form of a fiat currency that evaporates in thin air almost every day. It gives them less purchasing power every day they hold it. And we've seen the impact of real inflation over the last few years. And what that does to the poor is it just drives them lower and lower and lower in their foothold in the economy, makes it less accessible. Housing is less accessible. Food is less accessible. Gasoline is less accessible to the poor and lower middle class than it has been over decades. And it creates fraud and injustice when the Federal Reserve can print money and hand it out to their cronies just at the snap of a finger, and we will give a good example of that in just a few minutes. Jefferson warned that paper is poverty. After all, he lost 90% of his fortune on a loan deal in pre-Revolution Virginia currency because Virginia as a state decided to devalue their currency by 90%. So he got his loan paid back to him in inflated dollars, basically. And he warned further that paper money's abuses also are inevitable, and by breaking up the measure of value, make a lottery of all private property. Well, the Federal Reserve determined who won and who lost back in that housing boom and bust cycle, right? Who won? Well, we didn't, but BlackRock did. They came in, and over that last decade, they got a 1.6% note for a huge amount of money, and so they could outbid blue-collar competitors for these blue-collar neighborhoods and take over and raise the rents by 70% and destroy the opportunity for an entire class, an entire group of people to own homes. The abuses are inevitable. Madison said paper money is unjust and it's unconstitutional, and it clearly is. And it affects the rights of property as much as taking away equal value in land. You've all heard the slogan, taxation is theft. Paper money is theft. And James Madison said essentially that. Hamilton, one of the big proponents of a strong federal bank, even that kind of person warned about paper money. He knew it was evil. And he said it's in its nature pregnant with abuses and liable to be made the imposition or the engine of imposition and fraud, holding out temptations equally pernicious to the integrity of government and to the morals of the people. Think of all the way that entitlements and so on are enabled by a cheap currency, and think of the moral implications of so many of those entitlements, and you'll understand what Hamilton was talking about. So I'm going to focus on just one of the issues that was mentioned, the debt, the U.S. debt, and go deeper into this. I hope everybody can see this. It's a little bit of an eye strain chart. I can recognize that, but it's a graph of the total debt versus GDP ratio for this country. And so I'd like to focus on 3 different periods in the history of this country to see how fiat currency did or didn't work, so to speak, in the history of this country. The first period that I'd like to point out is from Jackson's presidency in 1829 to the Civil War. What is beautiful about this is you see the debt to GDP ratio is extremely small there, right? It's about 2% or less during that entire time. Wouldn't we love that? Wouldn't we thrive on that kind of a number? What did we have during that period? Jackson threw out the federal bank immediately. That's one thing. No central bank. There was no fiat currency. There was no war, and that's extremely important, as you'll see in this plot. And we had a constitutional government, as recognized by people like Alexis de Tocqueville. In his book, Democracy in America, he said this is a thriving government and economy because people care about their government. And they enforce the Constitution upon the elected officials. So that period, in my mind, was the golden age of the government in terms of how government really should work. Apart from slavery, apart from women voting and the many things we see and very clearly see in hindsight that were problems at that time, but in other ways that was a golden era. Debt to GDP ratio also always under 2%. The next time frame I'd like to look at is when the Federal Reserve was created. That's 1913, as you can see here. It was right before World War I. Note that the debt to GDP ratio in this time frame was descending from after the Civil War down to around 10%. Note also that that debt to GDP ratio from the time the Federal Reserve was created has never again been as low as 10%. It has never again been as low as it was before the Fed was created. And yet the Fed was created, wasn't it? Created to help with government, to stabilize our economy, to stabilize our money supply, and to do all wonderful things. And yet it has just wreaked havoc on this people. The third time frame I'd like to point out is when our fiat currency was inflicted upon us in 1971. We went off of the Bretton Woods Agreement of the 1940s, which established so much silver in this case as being $1. $1 was 0.91 ounces, I believe, of silver. According to Bretton Woods, we went off of that officially in 1971. And since then, we've had our fiat currency. And I think this plot actually, I'm a little off. I think it's a little bit over here, a little bit further down the line. We did, for a short period, inflate away a little bit of our debt, so to speak, in terms of debt to GDP ratio. It didn't inflate the debt away. It just made this ratio look better. But generally, from that time on, what's happened to our debt? It's skyrocketed. And that, since 1971, has been a time of relative peace, no major wars like World War I or World War II, and relative prosperity. What's been the cause? It's been our fiat currency. Fiat currency simply can't work. We all think of fiat currency as doing one thing. We think of it being cheap money, meaning that you can print it out of thin air and you can print any amount you want. But I'd like you to think of fiat currency in another sense with respect to gold and silver, because there's an important property of fiat currency that kind of gets lost in our way of thinking about it, that is at least as important as the fact that it can be printed out of thin air and it's cheap currency. That property is that it doesn't buy as much tomorrow as it does today. And over any given period, that's almost always been true. So what economic property does fiat currency carry with it, since it decreases in purchasing power? That economic property is it almost demands that you spend it today, or that you borrow more of it today. That's the economic character of fiat currency. Gold and silver money, we know, on the other hand, increases in purchasing power. What economic property would gold and silver carry with it then? If it increases in purchasing power as you go into the future, what would you like to do? You'd like to save it, hold it, and wait until you can get more good stuff out of it for every unit of gold or silver that you have. Gold and silver money makes us want to save. Fiat currency makes us want to spend, whether you're talking about individuals or governments. And so we've got a slide here that talks in detail about some of those facts. An ounce of silver bought roughly 3 gallons of gas today, and that was when gas was 36 cents an ounce, or 3 gallons of gas back in 1971, when a silver dollar was $1 and gas was 36 cents. It was roughly 3 gallons that it could buy. Today, a silver dollar is what, $25 of silver, roughly? Not quibbling about the details, but that's 8 gallons of gas. So it's increased in purchasing power over that same time. And if you looked at gold, the increase in purchasing power is even more profound. These are just facts about substantiating what I said just a moment ago. This slide is not about balanced budgets. This slide is about the power of fiat currency to command behavior. I want to make that clear. This slide is about the power of fiat currency to command behavior for otherwise what we think of as conservative people in the legislature. Because when the balanced budget requirement was invoked a few years back, here in the Kansas legislature, and it's been around for a long time, but this is pertaining to one particular session, the legislature chose to balance the budget not by decreasing spending, but by passing the largest tax hike in the history of the state. That's a testimony to the power of the fiat currency to command behavior. Because if in this state that would be the choice among our legislature, think about how powerful that currency must be in telling the legislature, spend, 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 and then you tax in order to accommodate that. Because that's what it does. I see a few people getting a little bit squeamish in their chair. I don't intend this to be a finger-pointing event. I mean this to be a testimony to the power of the fiat currency. Does that make sense? Okay. I'm giving another slide here that just shows the value of gold as a store of wealth. Gold kept up with the S&P 500 index as a store of wealth. This is a log chart, by the way, which is just a mathematical term explaining that the form of the chart. And it's also normalized to the price of gold in 1971 and the price of the S&P in 1971. So the bottom line is everything starts at 1, and then it goes up as a factor of the price increase compared to the price in 1971. But you see the ending result is up here, and they match. They both increased by about 60 times over that 50-year period from 1971 to 2021. Just shows that gold is an excellent store of value and actually is as successful as an investment as was over that period as was investing just in the S&P, which did pretty well. So we've talked about the power of the fiat currency to corrupt people's behavior in the sense of spending versus saving. But paper is also theft, as one of our founders said. And we see from this GAO report published in 2011, yes, the Government Accountability Office, that's hard for me to say, report published about the 2008 bailouts. In this report, and I love it when these government reports do these things because I'm going to talk about absolute corruption. And the data comes from this report, and it's the government report, and it's saying the Federal Reserve is corrupt. I love it when that happens because the government is pointing at itself and saying it's corrupt, but they used phrases like, oh, it was a managed conflict of interest. Managed conflict of interest? Let me tell you what that managed conflict of interest was, and I'll let you decide. Okay. But in this report, I love reading these kinds of things. I read bills. I'm a real boring old guy. I'm the kind of definition of geek. So I read through the first 40 pages of this document, enough to know pretty well what actually happened in the buyout of Bear Stearns by J.P. Morgan Chase Bank, which was crafted to address the supposed falling of the sky, at that time. Well, Bear Stearns had declined in stock price from roughly $150 in a year before this deal was crafted to $60 a share a month before this deal was crafted. And it fell to $30 a share on Friday, in that price range, on Friday, March 14th of 2008, when the Federal Reserve said, enough is enough. We've gone too far. This needs to be stopped. And so what the Federal Reserve did was they took a look at the toxic assets in Bear Stearns, and that was of an amount roughly $30 billion in book value, right? But those were toxic assets. And so presumably they were worth $20 billion or $10 billion or maybe even $5 billion. But the Federal Reserve contributed the largest portion towards a $30 billion restoration of these assets at book value They paid them at book value on these assets. And then what was trading for $30 a share on Friday, March 14th of 2008 was stolen from shareholders on Monday, March 17th, 2008, by an edict from the Federal Reserve. Those shares were stolen at roughly $10 a share. Shareholders were forced to give them up and sell them to JP Morgan Chase Bank. Now, what should have happened to Bear Stearns' stock price? It was $30 before their toxic assets were made whole and paid off at book value. What should have happened is the price should have gone to $60 or $150, something that it had been trading at for just not too recent of the past. And instead, those shares, after being restored, were stolen for $10 a share by an edict of the Federal Reserve. That's the bailout that we had to have, according to the Federal Reserve and the Federal Reserve Chair and all of our government speaking heads and everything else. That's the bailout we supposedly had to have. Oh, and by the way, I didn't mention this, but in this very document, it's mentioned that some of the people in the Federal Reserve that happened to craft this deal owned shares in JP Morgan Chase Bank. And that's the managed conflict of interest that I mentioned earlier. Managed for whom? Well, not managed for you or me or shareholders, managed for the Federal Reserve's agents that participated in this deal and crafted it to their benefit. So that's a good example of paper is theft, and that was an implicit message in at least two of the founders and an explicit message of at least one. So what is the solution? Well, the solution is very straightforward. It's to enforce the Constitution. And Article 1, Section 10 of our Constitution says very clearly, no state shall make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in the payment of debts. Now, I'd like to point out two things. First of all, this language is unambiguous. Okay, it's unambiguous. No debate about this. A fiat currency is illegal right there, it says so. And the second thing I'd like to point is, we've got to all go to Washington, D.C. and protest and call our representatives and say, get this figured out. No. That's not how this problem is solved. What does the Constitution say is the solution to the problem? Where do we solve it? Where do we solve it? Topeka. No state shall allow anything but gold and silver coin. We don't even have to go to Washington, D.C. to fix this. And sadly, had we done something like this a little over 50 years ago in 1971, and all 50 states said not only no, but heck no to this idea of fiat currency, we wouldn't have a fiat currency today. We would just have said, it's illegal here, so get it over it, and we're only going to accept silver certificates, and we will hold the reserves in our state to make that possible. We will hold gold and silver reserves. And so our money here in Kansas is the silver dollar. Okay, that could have been done 50 years ago. Now, we'll talk about some details of what this bill does and does not do. It does not outlaw the fiat currency. I want to make that clear right now. But what it does do is, first of all, a little history. It's been introduced. It was introduced into this session in early 2023. It's dead now because the session's essentially over. It was introduced first in 2019, and part of the bill on the sales tax exemption for gold and silver, and platinum and palladium were included, but that exemption was passed, but the rest of the bill didn't get passed. This bill was written by the Kansas by the Kansas Campaign for Liberty team. Again, in 2018 is when we wrote this. So it was in the Kansas House in 2019 and 20. It was reintroduced in the 2021-22 session. We decided not to use our resources to push it then. We did come back this year. It got introduced again, and we did move it at least out of the Senate Federal and State Affairs Committee. So that's a little history on the bill. What it does is it removes all forms of taxation on transactions involving certain legal tender. And we define legal tender as those coins minted in the federal mints in this country as legal tender. Some other bills in other states have chosen to allow all forms of specie, all forms of gold and silver, whether it's bars or medallions or coins, even Krugerrands and things like that, to be legal tender. This doesn't go that far, and I can explain why if you'd like, but that's a little bit of an explanation. It makes all transactions in specie voluntary, meaning that the IRS cannot come to you and say, you owe $100 in fiat currency, and we're going to force you to pay it. Since you're such a smarty pants and you have lots of gold and silver on hand, we're going to force you to pay it with 100 Morgan silver dollars. That's not legal. That's not allowed in this bill. Everything you do is voluntary with your silver and gold, unless you've signed a contract that says otherwise, okay? It does not ban the fiat dollar in Kansas. That's the last bullet point. I'd love to, but that would be pretty foolhardy, I think, okay, to even try that. Again, it removes punitive taxation of all forms. And let me just explain one thing about legal tender. Here's what legal tender really is. Legal tender means that I have a silver dime in my pocket. I pull it out of my pocket, I put it on the counter at Starbucks and I want to buy a cup of coffee, or I put it on the counter at Lowe's and I want to buy some nails. And when that person picks up that, they don't have to transfer it into or change it into fiat currency. Legal tender means they take it as it is. Okay, no change in currency required. And then that Starbucks owner puts that dime in their cash register, and then when they want to go buy food, they take that same dime out and they put it on the counter to buy food. If you have to convert back into fiat currency, that doesn't fully use the properties of legal tender. So any means by which you store gold and then convert it back into fiat currency and then spend it and so on, that's not real use of legal tender. Why is that so important? Well, because when I go into a gun store and put my silver dime on the counter and I want to buy something, or maybe put a silver dollar on the counter and I want to buy a small box of ammo for today's prices, I want to buy a box of ammo. I don't want anybody else to know that I did that transaction. And if somewhere online that transaction involved converting my silver stored way off site electronically somewhere into fiat currency and then back, that's not a private transaction anymore, is it? That's why legal tender and its full use is so important, okay? So we have a protection of privacy and a protection of spending power that's provided by the Legal Tender Act. And we want to make sure that any legal tender bill we would pass has that important character or property. You're protected through this if you store your wealth in gold and silver. You are protected if you use it, as I just described, in a fully private way. You are protected from those woke metrics being applied to your CBDCs or any other online stored resource that you have. Now imagine that government can control our spending. If they can control our spending through the use of the woke metrics on our CBDCs, if you choose to use CBDCs, if they come, they can control anything, right? That's the problem, and that's what this bill is designed to do, is prevent that possibility for those people who choose to take advantage of it. So there are some more advantages that this bill provides. It gives the protection I talked about. It lays the foundation for other bills to follow. The ultimate goal, of course, is fully transactional banking, but based on gold and silver. But without that starting point of having fully legal tender gold and silver usage where you can transact in a fully private way, there's no way. If all of your transactions are online, you may still have the woke metrics enforced on you, okay? But it lays the foundation for other bills, including fully transactional use of legal tender, where you have a reserve, you pay bills with your gold and silver reserves, and possibly even a fractional reserve system where you could ultimately loan out money against your reserves. I would advocate for very high and robust reserves. I'm thinking on the order of 20% or more. We could debate that. I'm not throwing that out to debate it. I'm just saying the reserve limit must be very robust. But a fully transactional and possibly even partial reserve system backed by gold and silver. The idea is that this could compete with the fiat currency, and eventually in the market, what wins? Good money or fiat currency? Well, the law of economics says that the good money will win. So we don't have to overthrow the fiat currency. We just have to outperform it, okay? And the next steps are, again, to create laws that would allow for that depository provision, and then ultimately for transactional banking and so on. And the end goal is to offer a constitutional alternative, like we said, to the fiat currency so that our gold and silver-based currency can outperform the fiat currency. And this would be a system that would be, I'm going to mention one thing that's really important here. The last bullet is extremely important. Besides being real legal tender, meaning that you can take money out of your pocket, put it on the counter, and spend it without converting it to fiat currency, there's one other thing about any future banking system based on gold and silver. Well, we've got to link it to the FDIC, right? No, that's the last thing we would want it to be. We want it totally decoupled from federal regulations and the federal banking system. We want this bank to be totally under the provisions of the Kansas government, right? And have nothing to do with any crony participants, have nothing to do with the Federal Reserve, have nothing to do with FDIC. And in fact, until you started working with the fractional reserve system, when you were just doing transactional banking, that's a 100% reserve system. There'd be no purpose in having the FDIC coupling, correct? I think I'm correct in saying that. You don't need protection for a 100% reserve system. The bank would buy private insurance for that purpose, and that's where that would come in. So we want to decouple ourselves from the federal government, not look at the federal government as the solution to our problems, okay? Because that is the problem, is the federal government. Okay, so what can we do? Well, the bill made it out of the Senate Federal and State Affairs Committee this year with, I felt, strong support, but it languished on the Senate floor. It didn't get above the line, so to speak, on the Senate floor this year. So when that happens, and when we tell people in Campaign for Liberty, we tell people, here's what's happening, and so here's what you need to do. You need to contact your elected officials in Topeka and demand that this bill get above the line. Okay, and when that doesn't happen, that means our group isn't big enough yet. That's pure and simple economic fact. So what we need to do is grow the group with an interest in this area, and that's why this QR code is here, and that's why the information is on your table with the QR code and the URL for the petition. And so as we grow the group, we'll let you know the status of this bill as it goes through the legislature next year. But whenever you don't make progress, whenever you get to a certain point in making progress and you don't get to the result you want in the legislature, it just means you have to come back with a stronger group. I'm a volunteer coordinator. We have never paid anybody to be a lobbyist. So this is totally an activist-based organization. It's absolutely grassroots. So with that, I'd like to leave myself open for questions. I think I've left a good amount of time for questions. I'm sure there will be questions. And thank you for your kind attention.
Okay, I get to hold the mic today, so members first and ask a question.
Actually, two questions.
Yeah.
One is the way you presented this, it sounded like the bill was to cover just minted coins and not, for instance, what a lot of people hold, you know, 1 ounce gold bars and things like
Mhm.
that.
Yeah.
And then, if you care to, could you comment on what you perceive the timeline for CBDC becoming widespread in the U.S.?
Both are excellent questions. And the first question can be addressed. You're wondering why not bars and why not Krugerrands and why not maple leaves? It's an excellent question, if I got that right. Is that correct? Okay. Well, sadly, I believe it's from 1944. If you want to Google this on your phone, Google Code of Federal Regulations. That's where the bureaucrats do their dirty work. And counterfeiting. And you'll find it's Title 18, Chapter 25, or vice versa, and it's paragraph 486. Okay, it's either 1825, 486, or it's 2518, I forgot, but it's 486. And guess what that says? It says, if you utter into circulation gold and silver coins, you're a counterfeiter. You're a counterfeiter. No kidding. And I'm going, oh my goodness. Now, if you did so with a Morgan silver dollar or a Mercury dime, and you took this to federal court, I think that they would lose. Because the Constitution says that the federal government shall mint gold and silver, so it's constitutional money, and the Constitution says that. The Constitution also says no state shall, which we just recited a moment ago, and therefore the only constitutional money is gold and silver, right? So I think if you took US minted coins to court in that application, the rulemaker, the bureaucrat, would lose, right? I believe so, and I'm profoundly behind that. And if they don't lose, we are at a real problem, okay? But if you did the same with a Canadian maple leaf, I would say the door's wide open for that bureaucrat to win by that rule. And that's why I'm very conservative in this approach. Would I support a bill that said Canadian maple leafs could be used as legal tender? Well, by golly, I think that's not a bad choice. After all, the Spanish doubloon was legal tender in this country for a long time. Pieces of 8, the quarter, that nomenclature comes from the use of the Spanish doubloon as legal tender in this country. We've had many forms of legal tender not minted in this country's mints. So that's the answer to the first question. Is that helpful? Okay. Googled it though, because I'd be interested in your thoughts about that. That's my take on that regulation. The second issue is, what's the time frame? Oh my gosh, I was hoping we would pass this bill this year. And then the groundwork would be laid. And most importantly, anything else that you put on top of that, in my mind, is not superfluous, but it's minuscule compared to passing the Legal Tender Act. Any of the transactional banking that's been done in the transactional banking laws that have been passed in other states, that provision is minuscule compared to just saying this is legal tender, gold and silver minted in this country is legal tender. That's got to be done, or nothing else can be meaningful. Okay, but I hope that we can get the support to pass this in 2025. And then I'd hope that from there, we could take the steps to study the bills in other states really carefully and make sure we don't make mistakes and make a bill as carefully as this one was made that would provide for storage of gold and silver and ultimately transactional banking in gold and silver. And I never predict when our bills will pass, but I just say our next step is to get it on the Senate floor. For this bill, the next step is to get it on the Senate floor and get a recorded vote. That's the next step, okay? I wish I could predict, okay?
Thank you for coming today. Very interesting.
Thank you for being
I
here.
remember in the early 80s at Wichita State, in the economic classes there, the professors there said that the reason for Bretton Woods was to um, uh, take the yoke off of our economy from the gold standard, the gold bugs at the time.
Yeah.
And it would let us really kind of, our economy turbo, going international, things like that. Say this past, how would we go back and calibrate the gold? In the early 70s, there was a gold to dollar ratio. How would that work if this would pass?
That's an outstanding question. So the real question is, do we go back to a fixed ratio where the silver dollar has 0.91 ounces of silver and gold is 35 US silver dollars? So that dictates the ratio. 1 ounce of gold, that is bought by 35 US. Well, obviously that ratio has gone much different. It's on the order of 80 or so now, right? The gold to silver ratio in US dollars. And so what would we do? You know, I'll tell you, I have two answers. One is, I really don't know. Okay, that's the factual answer. But I'll tell you the other answer. I'll tell you what I would like. I would like to see silver be our currency. And we wouldn't use a silver dollar. We would use a silver ounce. Why is the silver ounce advantageous? Because you can't play with a silver ounce. You can't devalue a silver ounce. And I do the same with the gold ounce. I would have two currencies. They would both be reserve currencies, a gold ounce and a silver ounce. And the silver ounce would be our accounting currency in my mind. And the gold ounce would be a reserve that you could use just because silver takes up too much space compared to gold, and you want to economize on that. That would be my answer. Now, people are going to hate me for that answer. We could have a days-long debate just on that answer alone. Oh, I'm not the expert that can go that far with this, but that would be my thought that I would love to discuss with some sound money economists. I would never even begin to broach this concept with a Federal Reserve trained or Keynesian trained economist. That's not where you're going to get that answer. Okay?
So, if you were on the reserve board member, would you bring the rate down or keep the same interest rate? If you want to bring it down by how much? Half a point or quarter point?
So if I were on the Federal Reserve Board right now, what would I do? Would I bring the rates down or keep them the same or raise the rates? And would I bring the rates down by as much as 0.5%? That's your question, right, Dr. Reddy?
Yes, that's my question.
Okay, yeah. Well, I hate to sound like I'm avoiding your question, but frankly, if I were on the Federal Reserve Board right now, I would resign. Okay, I truly would. And that's only if I would be more ashamed of that legacy than I could express. And so I couldn't do anything but resign. And I apologize because, Dr. Reddy, I respect your question. I really do. But to me, to address that question in the sense of saying whether I'd raise or lower the rates, I would immediately lobby within the organization to restore the sound money. And then I would know that I'd have to resign. I think that people on the Federal Reserve Board that think like I do have short lives, frankly. Short careers, right? I wouldn't have to resign.
Yeah, I can't translate this in my mind to how you're doing day-to-day transactions. I mean, like for instance, right now, I hate to carry the amount of money and paper bills I'd
Right.
have to use on a daily basis. So how are you translating this into day-to-day living?
That's an excellent question. What's the practical, how does this work in a practical sense, James, right? I mean, really, how are you going to carry around gold and silver coins, real legal tender, and buy a car? Or buy something, buy an appliance, buy something worth $500 or $50,000, or buy a house? Yeah, anything. That's a very, very good question. And that's why I do want to see the transactional banking component of this developed. Okay, in other words, I believe that we need the fully private, the possibility of having a fully private money. And yes, would it be cumbersome? Absolutely, like you're implying. I know we need that capability because otherwise there can be no privacy in your financial life. But would I want to see online transactional banking with gold and silver reserves made possible? Absolutely. Because that develops the practical side of gold and silver based currency being used in our economy. And like you're saying, until we get there, it's not very practical, is it? I agree.
Thanks for being here. How does Bitcoin or digital money come into play with this system?
Well, excellent question. How do Bitcoin and other digital currencies, ETH, Bitcoin, Chainlink, others like that, how do they come into play with respect to this? Boy, that's an excellent question, and it's one that I've kind of played with in my mind because do you realize that there are two kinds of currency, of cryptocurrencies in the nomenclature that I'm familiar with anyway? And maybe everybody else doesn't see this, but this is what I saw when I studied this 2 or 3 years ago. There are proof of work types of cryptocurrencies, right? Are you familiar with that nomenclature? Proof of work. Bitcoin is a proof of work currency. Did you realize that? You had to work using your computer to mine Bitcoin by performing a particular mathematical algorithm until you had eliminated possible solutions and included other possible solutions in the solution set, right? And that elimination of solutions was valuable and earned you Bitcoin. And the actual recognition of possible solutions was another way, I understand, and I have not done this, but it's a proof of work currency. There are also proof of stake currencies, meaning you make an investment in the currency and then you get paid on your investment, and you invest in that proof of stake currency by by US fiat dollars, or maybe by Bitcoin or by other means. But those are the two classes of currency. Now notice that we have a proof of work currency available in the online crypto space. What is our proof of work currency that we have available to us but do not use? Gold and silver. You have to go mine it. It's a proof of work currency, right? So its analog would be Bitcoin, in a sense, and other proof of work currencies. But we also have just a proof of stake currency, which is our fiat currency. Oh my gosh, does that say something about the proof of stake currencies online? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe you can make money on those as well. But that's the way I think about the online crypto space, so to speak, is in those two classes. And I have a friend, Blake Branson, who's the co-conspirator, the co-coordinator with me in Campaign for Liberty. And Blake is a genius at the crypto space and actually earns his employment through that. If any of you know Blake, he's a wonderful man. He's a absolutely devout Christian man, and gave me a book by Charles Spurgeon. You may know about it, but it's a devotional, and he's a wonderful person. But he's really, I wish he could come and just talk about that himself, but he's really not, this is not accessible to him right now. But he would be able to answer that question. He'd give you a lot better answer than I just did, okay? But that's the way I think about it. That doesn't precisely answer your question, and I know that. But that is the answer that I feel comfortable giving and all that I really know.
It was interesting, about 6 months ago, we traveled to a lot of third world countries, Costa Rica, Aruba, and it was amazing how everything was priced in US dollars and their local currencies. And in those countries, they were able to do the math to figure out if you only had half of the money in US dollars to their local currency and do it. So legally, would that be legal in the US is the question.
It's a good question. And so what you're saying is that there's an analog to what we might experience here already going on in other countries, in the sense that they already convert between the fiat dollar and their local currency back and forth all the time. And, it's amazing that wasn't Argentina that recently voted in a libertarian who vowed to couple their currency to the US dollar, and has done that, I understand. But yes, so the point you're making is that there is already an example of what a transitional situation might look like in this country for adaptation of a gold and silver legal tender. And I agree. And I think that's the way it's going to occur most peacefully. I don't want to ban the Federal Reserve because I'm old, but I'm not old enough, okay? And God willing, I could go today. My life has been wonderful, but it's not going to be peaceful if we ban the Federal Reserve today, okay? But if the market takes the Federal Reserve's fiat currency out of existence, then that could occur possibly more peacefully, although I know that there will be turmoil. But I believe that what you're seeing in those countries is going to be an example, or like what we might see if this becomes adopted, so to speak. And that's kind of to go to your question, James. How will this be managed? Will it be cumbersome? Well, I think if it's cumbersome, it won't work very well. And if it's not cumbersome, it will. That's as simple an answer as I can give. Okay, but people can make that calculation in their mind, and that's what you're pointing out. If you have a silver diamond, you put that on the table and it's worth $2.50, and your cup at Starbucks is $2.95, you don't owe them 45 copper pennies in addition to that silver dime, right? And that's what you're saying will happen. Yep.
Thievery, robbery, again, credit cards, we're using them so we don't have to carry too much money. James needs a whole wheelbarrow of cash just to do anything, so we convert over to your gold and silver that we're carrying around. All of a sudden, we're targets with this value on us.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And as the introduction said, we support gun rights. We absolutely are a Second Amendment supporter at Campaign for Liberty. Absolutely. And it is so important. I believe the Second Amendment is essential. And in fact, I believe the first clause of the Second Amendment is essential. And we often cite just the second clause of the Second Amendment.
And then a question over here, and then yours. That.
Thank you for the presentation. It's excellent. I happened to have taught a monetary policy course to start years ago.
Oh, thank you.
Continuing ed credit for real estate brokers. And what I learned in the process, that particularly when I got a group of little people, it didn't make a lot of sense to them. So I introduced playing poker. And they would give me $100, I give them 100 chips, and we're playing and they're doing well, and I'm giving friends free things and handing things out, and they get 600 chips and they decide to cash them in, and I say, here's $10. I use that system, and the other one is I have this $50 Venezuelan bill that I'd be happy to sell to anybody for $10. A year ago, it was worth 22 cents. And I use that in my courses rather than monetary policy, which is not. Would you agree that monetary policy has never been properly used the way it's set up?
Properly used?
Yes.
Yeah, education for monetary policy has been abused, maybe?
Education is good, but
Mhm.
the folks appointed pay attention to politics, not the proper use of the 4 items they had to control.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good question and a very good point. You know, that's a very apt demonstration of how fiat currency really works, is that you don't ever benefit from inflation unless you're one of the most well-connected, like BlackRock, which, as I mentioned before, got 1.6% interest rate on a huge note. I don't know how they did that. I didn't track it down to see which bank it was gotten from. But that's a very good point and a very good question. I think that monetary policy is controlled by the money. Monetary policy education is controlled by the money. I don't think you'll find Austrian school economic policy represented. Is it represented in any major university in this country? Does anybody know? I don't think. It is in Auburn. No kidding. So we have one school maybe out of hundreds. That's good to know. But I had thought that there were none. Okay. But I think that, go ahead, yeah.
DeSantis just passed something in Florida a few weeks ago, having to do with, I think, CB,
DC? Mm-hmm.
but I don't know the details. So how does this correlate with what they did?
So you're mentioning that some states are actually passing bans on CBDC. Is that correct?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So Florida did that.
Mm-hmm.
And so this, how does this compare? I mean,
Very good question. What would the other bill be necessary as part of the question? How does this really help? How does this bill help versus what that bill would do? I do believe that a ban on a declaration that CBDC is not legal tender needs to be passed as a statute in Topeka. I'll put it that way. Okay? CBDC should never be allowed to be legal tender. Our fiat currency should have received that kind of attention from our state legislature 52 years ago or 53 years ago. But it didn't. But certainly CBDC should be declared not ever to be legal tender in this state. The bill, I'm going to start looking at those bills in other states and passing them through my mentors, because I would like to see a good bill introduced. And what it must be is it must be effective and workable. Okay, it must have some kind of teeth against the use of CBDC or the enforced use of CBDC in this state. It has to have teeth, meaning if you do violate this bill, you will be punished. Okay, and it can't be pie in the sky, wishful type, hopeful type teeth, meaning, oh, we're going to arrest a federal agent at the border. No, we don't have that. I sorrowfully say this. We don't have that kind of people reliably throughout our law enforcement infrastructure. I have a great deal of respect for law enforcement. Don't misunderstand me. But under our liberal governor, if it were the Highway Patrol's duty to do so, to arrest a federal agent who's going to enforce CBDC on our people, what's our liberal governor going to do? We pass the statute, says the governor must tell the Highway Patrol to arrest that person at the border. I think you're wishing for things. So we want the law to be standalone, not rely on the governor being a conservative Republican or the sheriff being a conservative constitutional Republican. The law has to stand on its own with teeth and enforceable enforceableness, so to speak. And it has to be meaningful. It has to really do the job. Those laws are really tough to write. Okay, so that's going to take a long time. Our priorities as a team here at Campaign for Liberty are to finish up the Kansas Gun Rights Preservation Act work that we started this year and reintroduce it next year. The other priority is to pass this bill or to get it moving through the legislature. If we have resources, we're going to address the CBDC issue and make it illegal. That would be wonderful. Did that cover your question? Yeah.
Thank you, John.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for all your attention.
Thank you, Ron.